What do you think cross-gen PS6 titles will run at on base PS5 and on the Pro? I'm happy with my base PS5, but I'm worried new games will be capped at 30 FPS. I think there's actually a really good reason to be worried about games being capped at 30 FPS, because if you look at like the history of cross-generation releases, there are necessary cutbacks that need to happen, right? So, if you're going to be pushing for 60 or even 120 on PS6, it kind of makes, and you've got access to stuff like frame generation, you've got access to, fantastic features like past-facing, ray-tracing. It just kind of makes sense to pare back everything for the last generation systems. That's not to say that the games are actually going to be bad as such. 30 FPS, people, there was entire console generations where the majority of the releases came out at 30 FPS and people kind of lived with it. I do think that, reducing frame rate is probably going to be one of the vectors that developers use to make games scalable. It just makes sense, right? You've only got a limited amount of compute versus the higher end device. You've got to make cutbacks in several regards. So I do think that probably will be, reduced resolution, reduced frame rates. There will be reductions in ray tracing fidelity. There won't be past tracing. It will be stuff like that, right? The extent to which you feel you're missing out on something, it's going to vary from person to person. But I do think we are going to be looking at this super extended cross-gen period. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think we are looking at super extended cross-gen period, and I think it makes sense. It's just the whole business has changed, right? Mm-hmm. With regards to this stuff, and the games now they take so much longer to make. They're more expensive, and they do need to scale across a wider range of hardware. The days of just being like, all right, here's this new hardware, and we're making this game specifically only for that. It's not realistic anymore, by and large. And so as a result, it doesn't make sense to leave anyone in the dust at this point so quickly, unless you actually are doing something that it would push beyond what that machine could do. And that's usually only feasible financially if you're a first party team, right? Because then, Sony or whoever, Nintendo, they can essentially fund that and be like, all right, this is used to sell the machine. But for third parties, it doesn't make any sense. So as a result, I think they're just going to continue to go where the users are.
Yeah. Yeah,
but it's better than it's ever been, right? Like if you look back, like the cross-gen from PS4 to PS5, it's been largely pretty good, and PS4 versions of games are still pretty good, I would say, versus the PS3 to PS4 era, where PS3 versions of next-gen games were usually really, 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 really bad. With a few exceptions, especially on the 360 side, where you had like the Rise of the Tomb Raider port, for instance. And so we got that occasionally, but by and large, that cross-gen period was terrible.
Yeah, I think this cross-gen period has been relatively a whole lot better.
Exactly.
Principally because there's commonality in the designs from last gen to current gen. Alex, I mean, this is basically the story of scalability, which has been a PC thing since the year dot, right? So where do you see this landing?
Well, I actually think there will be not that many 30 FPS titles given the current course of things, just because I see games like Arc Raiders or Battlefield come out, or High Guard, whatever. We didn't talk about that yet. High Guard. But, I see these games where the game's making a lot of headlines and they're blowing up in the market. They're doing really well. They're 60 FPS titles. And the broad majority of users are going to be on a PS5 like machine, either on PC or on PS5, right? And I think a lot of developers would be afraid of the negative backlash of having a game that, by necessity of its, being a more complex beast, having to target 30 FPS. I think there's a lot of negative backlash against games that are 30. And I'm not sure a lot of developers would want to stand up to that media scrutiny or that community scrutiny. So I think they would maybe avoid it, excluding some titles. I think things like GTA 6, I still think it's going to be 30. And I think the PS6 version is going to be the 60 FPS console release. And, I think there's going to be a couple other titles that are going to go that route just because that's their remit. I think something like, if it ever comes out, Marvel 1943, I could imagine that being a 30 FPS title.
Right.
There's certain titles that are going to be that like cinematic, ultra blowout, AAA, highest headline game that's gorgeous. And then people kind of put up with the 30. But I think for the most part, a lot of people are just not going to be playing a lot of 30 FPS games unless it's the latest, hit jank machine game, like an Ark. What is the name of that game? The Ark series, Ark Survival Evolved or whatever. People play those kind of janky games at 30 because they like this experience regardless of the janky frame rate, right? But I think a lot of people, when it comes to like a highly polished new release, they are looking towards 60 or at least as close as possible.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I still think there will be a lot more 30 games, but you look at like the Witcher 4 tech demo that was running on a base PlayStation 5. You can see how it's running at at 60 frames per second because, the image quality is actually very, very soft. So presumably there's quite a low internal resolution there. But you can also see how a PlayStation 6 version would side by side look a whole lot better.
Yes.
So maybe that's the route forward. Maybe I'm being a bit too pessimistic. We just need to wait and see.